Forgiveness always arrives late for the people who confuse loyalty with something ordinary. I learned that lesson on a grey Tuesday morning when I carried a cardboard box through the polished marble lobby of Romano Global Holdings, trying not to let anyone see my hands shaking. 5 years of my life fit inside that box. A coffee mug with tiny blue flowers painted around the rim. A worn leather notebook filled with schedules only I could understand. A framed photograph of my parents standing in front of their little bookstore in Vermont before cancer took my mother and debt took the store. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked if I was all right. The security guard who had greeted me every morning simply lowered his eyes and looked away. Maybe it was easier that way. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 28 years old, and for the past 5 years I had been the personal assistant to Adrian Romano, the most feared businessman in New York, a man whose influence reached every boardroom and every charity gala, whose silence could terrify executives more than anyone else's anger. People whispered different stories about him. Some called him a billionaire, others called him something much darker. I never asked which version was true, because assistants survive by learning what questions should never be spoken aloud. Every morning I arrived before sunrise. Every evening I left long after the city lights reflected across the Hudson River. I memorized every meeting, every anniversary, every allergy, every security protocol, every private preference that allowed his impossible schedule to function without collapsing. If his jet landed 30 minutes early, I already had another car waiting. If an investor cancelled at the last second, another meeting quietly appeared before anyone noticed the gap. If a difficult client demanded impossible accommodations, they somehow believed those miracles had always been part of the plan. Adrian never praised those details. He simply expected them to happen, and somehow I accepted that. Maybe because I believed hard work eventually became visible. Maybe because my father always said character was what you built when nobody was watching. That morning began like every other. Manhattan wore its familiar costume of rushing footsteps, taxi horns, and impatient ambition. I balanced 2 coffees, reviewed the day's calendar on my tablet, and stepped into the executive elevator. Before the doors could close, Vanessa Hart slipped inside, wearing an immaculate cream designer suit and the confident smile of someone who had never doubted a single decision in her life. She was the newly hired Chief Operations Officer, recruited from one of the country's largest consulting firms. 3 weeks earlier, she had arrived promising modernization, efficiency, and fresh leadership. Since then, departments had become quieter. Experienced employees suddenly disappeared. Loyalty had become an outdated word, replaced by measurable performance metrics and colorful presentation slides. She glanced at the coffee in my hand before offering a smile that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Romano won't be needing you anymore," she said, so casually that for a second I thought she was joking. I laughed once, uncertain. She didn't. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, where human resources waited beside Adrian's office, carrying a sealed envelope with my name, printed across the front. Adrian's office door remained closed. I stared at it for several seconds, expecting it to open. Expecting him to step outside and tell everyone there had been a mistake. It never happened. Vanessa folded her arms with quiet satisfaction, while the HR manager cleared his throat and gently explained that my position had been eliminated, effective immediately. They thanked me for my years of service. They wished me success in my future endeavors. They never realized they had just removed the one person quietly holding together the invisible pieces of an empire that even its owner had stopped noticing. The elevator doors closed behind me with a quiet chime that sounded strangely final. I walked through the revolving glass doors into the crisp October air, clutching the cardboard box against my chest, while Midtown Manhattan rushed around me, without slowing for anyone's heartbreak. Yellow taxis splashed through puddles left by an early morning drizzle. Businessmen hurried toward meetings. Tourists paused to photograph skyscrapers that had stopped impressing the people who worked beneath them years ago. Life continued exactly as it had before, except mine no longer had a place inside it. I found an empty bench in Bryant Park, and finally opened the envelope Human Resources had handed me. 3 months of severance pay, a carefully worded recommendation letter signed by someone I had never met, instructions for returning company credentials, 5 years reduced to polished corporate language that somehow managed to sound both grateful and indifferent. I smiled despite myself. They had even forgotten to include the emergency contact binder that never left my desk because nobody else knew it existed. My phone buzzed before I could finish reading. Emma's name appeared across the screen. My younger sister never called during work hours, unless something mattered. I answered before the first ring ended. "Please tell me you are taking lunch for once," she teased before hearing my silence. "Claire." I looked across the park where children chased pigeons while their parents laughed nearby. "I do not work there anymore," I whispered. She did not ask what happened. She knew me well enough to understand that if I sounded this calm, I had already cried. "Come home," she said softly. "We will figure everything out." Home. The word felt unfamiliar. My apartment had become little more than a place to sleep between endless workdays. That evening, I unlocked the door before sunset, for the first time in years. The quiet startled me. No vibrating phone demanding schedule changes, no international conference calls, no encrypted emails arriving every 10 minutes. I brewed chamomile tea simply because I finally had time to wait for water to boil. As the kettle whistled, I noticed something sitting on my kitchen shelf. A tiny ceramic lighthouse I had bought during a rare weekend trip to Maine with my father years ago. I could not remember the last time I had actually looked at it. My life had become so focused on managing someone else's future that I had quietly misplaced pieces of my own. Across town, another day unfolded inside Romano Global, without interruption, or at least that was what everyone believed. Vanessa confidently occupied the executive conference room, presenting redesigned workflows to department heads who nodded without understanding the countless invisible systems that had never appeared on any organizational chart. Adrian Romano entered precisely at 9 o'clock, expecting the first briefing of the morning to begin within seconds as it always had. Instead, an unfamiliar junior assistant hurried toward him carrying 3 folders in the wrong order and an expression that betrayed growing panic. His coffee contained sugar even though he had never taken sugar. His first meeting had been scheduled in the wrong building. A client from Chicago remained waiting on a secure video call because nobody had remembered the time zone difference. Adrian said nothing. He simply adjusted his cufflinks while the room grew noticeably quieter. Small mistakes happened every day inside every company, yet by lunchtime there were more. A missing contract that should have been prepared 2 days earlier. A confidential visitor left waiting downstairs because nobody recognized his face. Flowers delivered to the wrong charity event, tiny cracks spreading across a structure everyone assumed could never bend. Adrian stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, his blue eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. For the first time in years, his perfectly ordered world felt unfamiliar, and he could not yet identify the one absence quietly unraveling everything. By Wednesday morning, the city had settled into its usual rhythm, but mine had completely changed. I woke naturally instead of to the vibration of 3 different alarm clocks scheduled around Adrian Romano's calendar. Sunlight streamed through my apartment window, warming hardwood floors I had barely noticed for years. I made breakfast instead of grabbing coffee on the run. Fresh blueberries, scrambled eggs, and toast. It felt almost luxurious, not because it was expensive, but because nobody expected anything from me for the next 10 minutes. I carried my coffee onto the small fire escape outside my kitchen window and listened to the sounds of Manhattan waking below. Somewhere a dog barked, a delivery truck backed into an alley. A church bell echoed across the neighborhood. Ordinary sounds, sounds I had forgotten existed beneath the constant pressure of executive life. My laptop chimed with an email notification. 3 recruiting firms had somehow learned that I was available. 2 offered interviews with investment companies. 1 promised a generous salary if I could start immediately. I closed the messages without replying. For the first time in years, I wanted to think before saying yes. Meanwhile, 40 floors above Park Avenue, another morning refused to cooperate. Adrian walked into his office exactly at 7:30, expecting the day's briefing to already be waiting on his desk. Instead, scattered folders covered the polished walnut surface in no recognizable order. The replacement assistant hurried inside carrying another stack of documents. "I am sorry, sir." Legal requested revisions overnight. Adrian accepted the papers without speaking. His eyes moved across the pages once before stopping. These contracts were supposed to go to Chicago yesterday. The young assistant swallowed nervously. I thought they were scheduled for tomorrow. Adrian looked toward the digital calendar mounted across the wall. Tomorrow. Somebody had changed the date. Claire would never have changed a legal deadline without confirming it personally. The thought appeared unexpectedly, disappearing almost as quickly as it arrived. Throughout the morning, similar interruptions continued. A charity luncheon had been confirmed twice under different reservation names. A private security briefing had not been forwarded to his driver. An international investor arrived carrying questions nobody inside the building had prepared to answer, because the background research had never been completed. Vanessa insisted these were temporary adjustment issues common during organizational restructuring. She spoke confidently inside the conference room, while colorful graphs filled the presentation screen. Efficiency always dips before long-term improvement, she explained. Several executives nodded politely. Adrian remained silent, his attention drifting toward the empty chair outside his office, where Claire had spent countless mornings quietly solving problems before anyone else even noticed them. He realized something uncomfortable. He could not remember ever asking how she managed everything. He had simply assumed excellence was effortless. Late that afternoon he reached for his coffee, taking one sip before setting the cup down again. It was too sweet. Every cup this week had been too sweet. Such a meaningless detail, yet somehow impossible to ignore. He opened the top drawer of his desk, searching for a file, and discovered something tucked neatly beneath several folders. A handwritten checklist in familiar blue ink, emergency vendor contacts, backup flight coordinators, hospital information for every executive, personal reminders he had never known existed because she had quietly handled every contingency without seeking recognition. At the bottom of the page, one sentence caught his attention. Double-check Mr. Romano remembers his father's birthday dinner because he always forgets when negotiations run late. Adrian stared at the words much longer than he intended. Tomorrow was his father's birthday. He had completely forgotten again. Only this time nobody had reminded him. Across the city I stood inside my father's favorite neighborhood bookstore, running my fingers across shelves filled with stories waiting to be discovered. The elderly owner smiled warmly as I carried a stack of novels toward the register. "Taking a vacation?" he asked. I smiled for the first time in days. Maybe I am finally remembering how to have a life. The following evening, the city glowed beneath a blanket of amber streetlights, while cold autumn air swept between the towers of Midtown. I was halfway through making homemade pasta when my phone buzzed with another message from a recruiter. I ignored it. Flower dust covered my hands, soft music drifted through the apartment, and for once my evening belonged entirely to me. It felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, yet strangely peaceful. Across the room a notebook rested on my coffee table. Instead of meeting agendas and executive schedules, its pages now held ideas I had not allowed myself to consider in years. Community literacy programs, administrative consulting for small non-profit organizations, volunteer work at local libraries, dreams that had quietly waited while I built someone else's empire. At Romano Global, however, calm had become increasingly difficult to find. Adrian stood outside the private dining room of an exclusive Manhattan restaurant, staring through the glass entrance with an expression none of his security team had ever witnessed. His father sat alone inside, checking his watch every few minutes before politely thanking the waiter for another cup of coffee. The reservation had been made months earlier. Claire had arranged it herself. Every year she reminded him 48 hours in advance, confirmed transportation, coordinated the menu around his father's dietary restrictions, and even ensured the pianist quietly played his parents' favorite song near dessert. This year nobody had called, nobody had confirmed. Adrian had remained trapped in meetings until nearly 8 o'clock, before suddenly remembering the dinner from the handwritten note hidden inside his desk. By the time he arrived, his father was already putting on his coat. "Running late again?" the older man asked, with a gentle smile that somehow made the disappointment harder to bear. Adrian nodded once. "I forgot." His father looked at him for a long moment before answering quietly. "No. Someone who always remembered for you is no longer here." Those words followed Adrian all the way back to his car. They echoed through the silent drive across Manhattan, until he finally instructed his driver to return to headquarters instead of home. The building was nearly empty when he stepped into the executive floor. Cleaning crews quietly polished marble floors, while distant vacuum cleaners hummed behind closed office doors. Claire's former desk remained occupied by someone else now, yet everything felt different, less organized, less alive. He walked slowly toward the storage room, where personal belongings from recently departed employees were temporarily kept before disposal. Inside, dozens of labeled boxes lined metal shelves. He found hers almost immediately, Claire Bennett. Human Resources had packed everything with professional efficiency. Adrian lifted the lid without fully understanding why. A nearly empty package of peppermint tea, color-coded notebooks, thank you cards from junior employees, whose names he barely recognized. A tiny emergency sewing kit, batteries for presentation clickers, spare reading glasses still inside unopened packaging with a handwritten note attached, in case Mr. Romano forgets his again. He closed his eyes for a brief second. None of these items had appeared in any performance report. No spreadsheet could measure the 1,000 invisible ways one thoughtful person quietly prevented chaos from reaching everyone else. He carried the notebook back to his office and opened another page. Detailed instructions covered every imaginable emergency, each line written with calm precision. Flight delays, medical situations, technology failures, family reminders, vendor backups. Every page solved problems before they could become crises. Adrian leaned back in his chair, staring across the empty office, where silence suddenly felt heavier than usual. Vanessa had eliminated one salary from the budget. On paper it looked efficient. In reality, she had removed years of knowledge that no replacement could inherit overnight. Across town I finished dinner, washed the dishes, and settled beside my apartment window with one of the novels I had purchased the day before. My phone remained face down on the table. For the first time in years, nobody's emergency belonged to me anymore, and neither Adrian nor anyone inside his towering glass headquarters had yet realized that the greatest value is almost always invisible until the day it quietly walks away. Saturday arrived wrapped in crisp blue skies, and the kind of autumn sunshine that made Central Park shimmer with gold and crimson leaves. I had almost forgotten weekends could exist without conference calls or emergency itinerary changes. Emma convinced me to meet her at the small farmers' market near Union Square, where local musicians played acoustic guitars while families wandered between stalls filled with fresh apples, homemade bread, and flowers that smelled like the last warm days before winter. I laughed more that morning than I had during the previous 6 months combined. My sister noticed immediately. "You look different," she said as we carried paper cups of hot apple cider through the crowd. "Lighter." I smiled, watching children chase soap bubbles drifting through the air. Maybe I finally stopped carrying things that were never mine to carry. The words surprised even me. For years I believed my worth depended on being indispensable. If everyone needed me, then I mattered. Now I was beginning to understand there was another way to live, one where peace did not have to be earned through exhaustion. Back inside Romano Global, the atmosphere continued changing in ways no presentation could disguise. Employees who once moved confidently through the executive floor now exchanged uncertain glances. Department heads quietly delayed decisions because nobody knew which priorities had changed overnight. Vanessa introduced new reporting systems almost daily, yet each adjustment somehow created 2 more unanswered questions. Adrian observed everything without interrupting. He had built an empire by recognizing patterns before anyone else could see them, and a pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every problem traced back to something Claire had once handled so naturally that nobody realized it required extraordinary judgment. Late that afternoon, his longtime chief financial officer entered carrying a thick folder. "You asked for operational reports," he said, placing them across the conference table. Adrian flipped through the pages. Numbers remained strong. Revenue continued climbing. Expenses looked controlled. On paper, the company appeared healthier than ever. Yet another document rested beneath the financial summaries: employee retention, internal satisfaction surveys, administrative response times. Quietly, almost invisibly, every one of those measurements had declined during the past 3 weeks. "Interesting," Adrian murmured. The financial officer hesitated before speaking again. "There is something else you should probably know." Adrian looked up. "Several senior clients have asked whether Miss Bennett retired. They specifically requested her assistance for upcoming projects." Adrian remained silent. Apparently she remembered details nobody ever documented. Birthdays, family preferences, medical accommodations, personal traditions. They trusted her. After the meeting ended, Adrian walked toward the large window overlooking the city below. Thousands of people moved through Manhattan, carrying invisible stories of their own. Somewhere among them, Claire was building a life that no longer revolved around his schedule. The realization unsettled him more than he expected, not because work had become inconvenient, but because he had never once asked whether she had dreams beyond the office walls. He knew her handwriting better than her voice. He knew her efficiency better than her happiness. That thought lingered long after sunset. Meanwhile, my own evening ended inside the neighborhood library, where volunteers gathered every Saturday to help adults prepare for high school equivalency exams and job interviews. I had signed up almost impulsively after seeing a flyer on the community bulletin board. A nervous middle-aged woman struggled to organize her resume, while apologizing every few minutes for asking simple questions. I smiled and slid my chair closer. "Everyone starts somewhere," I told her gently. "You are not behind. You are simply beginning a new chapter." 2 hours passed before I noticed the time. As we packed our notebooks, the library director stopped beside me. "Claire, have you ever considered doing this professionally? You have an unusual gift for making overwhelmed people feel capable." Walking home beneath rows of glowing streetlights, I realized nobody had complimented me for answering emails faster or solving impossible calendars. They appreciated something far more personal. For the first time in years, I was being valued not for how useful I was to power, but for how much hope I quietly restored in ordinary people, while across the city, the man who once depended on my quiet strength was only beginning to understand the difference. Monday morning arrived with cold rain tapping gently against my apartment windows, but for the first time in years I did not dread the sound. I wrapped both hands around a mug of coffee and watched the streets below slowly fill with umbrellas moving like colorful currents through Manhattan. My calendar was almost empty, except for one interview scheduled that afternoon with a non-profit educational foundation. The salary would be smaller than what I earned before, but strangely that no longer frightened me. I had spent years believing security came from working beside powerful people. Now I was beginning to suspect real security came from waking each morning without carrying someone else's impossible expectations on my shoulders. I chose a navy blue sweater instead of the formal executive suits that had become my uniform. It felt like choosing myself instead of my job. Across town, the executive floor at Romano Global had become unusually tense. Adrian entered the boardroom 5 minutes before an important negotiation with international partners, only to discover that critical briefing materials were incomplete. Several pages referenced supporting documents that had never been attached. Financial projections contained inconsistent formatting. Travel schedules conflicted with meeting times. None of the mistakes were catastrophic by themselves. Together, they created something far more dangerous: doubt. Adrian quietly closed the folder and looked around the conference table. Nobody spoke. Vanessa immediately stepped forward with polished confidence. "We experienced temporary administrative disruptions during the restructuring process, but everything is under control." Adrian studied her expression without revealing his own thoughts. He had heard those same words every day for nearly a month. Temporary. Under control. Yet every sunrise introduced another preventable problem. After the meeting concluded, his oldest advisor, Michael Donnelly, remained behind. Michael had worked beside the Romano family for almost 30 years, and rarely offered opinions unless asked directly. "May I speak honestly?" he asked. Adrian nodded once. Michael folded his reading glasses before continuing. "You built this company by rewarding competence. Somewhere along the way, you started assuming competence would always be there whether you noticed it or not." Adrian remained silent. "Miss Bennett never asked for recognition," Michael continued. "That made it easy for everyone else to forget she deserved it." Those words lingered long after Michael left the room. Adrian slowly opened one of Claire's handwritten notebooks again. This time he noticed details he had overlooked before. Tiny reminders to send flowers whenever an employee lost a family member. Quiet instructions to reserve the conference room closest to the elevator because one board member struggled with chronic knee pain. Notes about which junior employees were studying at night and needed flexible schedules before final exams. She had not simply managed logistics, she had quietly managed people. She remembered what everyone else overlooked because she believed small kindnesses prevented larger problems. At nearly the same hour, I stepped into the non-profit foundation's modest brick office on the Upper West Side. There were no marble floors or private security teams. Framed children's artwork decorated the hallways. Volunteers greeted one another by first name. During the interview, the executive director asked about my experience coordinating complex operations. I answered honestly, but found myself speaking less about efficiency and more about helping people feel supported during difficult moments. The director smiled warmly. "Technical skills can be taught," she said. "Compassion usually cannot." As I left the building, my phone vibrated unexpectedly. An unfamiliar number appeared across the screen. I hesitated before answering. "Miss Bennett?" a calm voice asked. "This is Michael Donnelly, from Romano Global. I hope I am not disturbing you." My heartbeat slowed rather than quickened. "Not at all." He paused briefly before speaking again. "Mr. Romano does not know I am calling. I simply wanted to ask whether you would consider meeting me for coffee. There are some things I believe you deserve to hear, and perhaps a few things someone else still needs to understand before it is too late." The rain had stopped by the time I reached the small coffee shop Michael had chosen, tucked between an old bookstore and a family-owned bakery on a quiet Upper West Side corner. The place smelled of cinnamon, fresh espresso, and worn paperbacks. It felt nothing like the polished luxury of executive boardrooms, where every conversation carried hidden agendas. Michael was already waiting by the window, his grey wool coat folded neatly across the empty chair beside him. He stood as I approached, offering the same warm smile I remembered from countless mornings when he quietly thanked me for remembering details everyone else overlooked. "Claire," he said gently, "thank you for coming." I sat across from him, wrapping both hands around a cup of hot tea after the waitress left. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, pedestrians hurried past, carrying umbrellas beneath clearing skies, while afternoon sunlight slowly broke through the clouds. Finally, Michael sighed. "You look healthier." I laughed softly. "I have been sleeping again." He nodded, as though that simple sentence answered more than either of us realized. "The office has not been the same since you left." I looked down at the steam rising from my cup. "People adjust." Michael shook his head. "People do. Character does not." He reached into his leather briefcase and placed a familiar blue notebook on the table between us. My handwriting covered every page. "Mr. Romano has been reading these almost every evening." I blinked in surprise. "Why?" Michael smiled sadly. "Because he finally understands they were never just schedules." My fingers rested lightly against the notebook without opening it. Every page represented years of quiet habits, developed one thoughtful decision at a time. "He never asked me to stay," I whispered. Michael did not defend him. Instead, he answered with uncomfortable honesty. "No, he believed the systems would continue, because they always had. He never realized the systems had your name." Silence settled comfortably between us. It was not awkward. It was reflective. After several moments, Michael continued. "Claire, do you remember the scholarship fund created 3 years ago for employees' children?" I nodded immediately. I had coordinated every application myself. "Mr. Romano believes legal proposed it." I smiled faintly. "Legal opposed it. They thought it would cost too much." Michael's eyes softened. "Exactly. You spent weeks gathering anonymous data, proving how education assistance improved employee retention. You convinced him without ever attaching your own name to the proposal." I had almost forgotten. There had been dozens of moments like that. Quiet improvements that mattered more than recognition. Michael leaned forward slightly. "There is something else you should know. During last week's board meeting, one director praised Vanessa for streamlining executive operations." I looked away toward the rain-soaked sidewalk outside. "And," Mr. Romano interrupted him. Michael's voice remained calm. He said the company had confused visible leadership with invisible leadership, and admitted they were not the same thing. My heart skipped unexpectedly. That sounded nothing like the Adrian Romano I had known for 5 years. Michael smiled. "He has been asking questions, Claire. Real questions, not about profits, about people. I remained quiet, because I did not know what to do with that information. Across the city, Adrian stood alone inside his office, long after everyone else had gone home. Claire's empty desk remained visible through the glass wall separating their offices. For years he had believed leadership meant making the largest decisions. Now he found himself wondering whether true leadership began with noticing the smallest ones. He picked up his phone more than once that evening, scrolling until Claire Bennett's contact appeared on the screen. His thumb hovered above the call button, before stopping each time. Some conversations could not begin with authority. Some apologies could not be delegated. For the first time in his career, a man capable of commanding entire rooms discovered he had no idea how to ask one ordinary woman for another chance to simply be heard. The next morning arrived bright and clear, the kind of October day that made Manhattan look almost hopeful. Sunlight reflected from glass towers, while a cool breeze carried the scent of roasted coffee and fallen leaves through the streets. I had just finished another volunteer session at the library when my phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. I considered ignoring it, then answered anyway. Claire Bennett speaking. There was a brief pause before a calm, unmistakable voice finally spoke. This is Adrian Romano. 5 years of hearing that voice inside conference rooms should have prepared me for the moment. Somehow it did not. I remained silent, waiting. I understand if you do not wish to speak with me, he continued. But I would appreciate 20 minutes of your time. No business, no expectations, just a conversation. I looked across the quiet reading room where a teenage student smiled proudly after solving a difficult math problem without assistance. A month ago, I would have cancelled everything to accommodate Adrian's schedule. Today I glanced at my own calendar instead. Tomorrow, I answered calmly. 6 o'clock. The Conservatory Garden in Central Park. Thank you, he replied simply, before ending the call. The following evening, the park glowed beneath soft golden light as the sun disappeared behind the skyline. Couples walked slowly along winding paths, while musicians filled the cool air with gentle violin melodies. I arrived a few minutes early, wearing a simple wool coat and comfortable boots. Adrian was already there, standing beside a stone fountain, with his hands inside the pockets of a charcoal overcoat. Without the constant movement of assistants, executives, and security teams surrounding him, he looked unexpectedly human. More tired than I remembered. More thoughtful. He stepped forward as I approached. Thank you for coming. You asked politely, I answered with a small smile. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The silence felt unfamiliar, because throughout 5 years together, every conversation had revolved around deadlines, meetings, flights, or contracts. Finally, Adrian looked toward the fountain before speaking quietly. I owe you an apology that should have happened weeks ago. I listened without interrupting. When human resources eliminated your position, I approved the restructuring without asking enough questions. I assumed the company would continue functioning because I believed processes mattered more than people. His voice remained steady, but there was unmistakable regret beneath every word. I was wrong. The honesty surprised me, more than the apology itself. Adrian Romano had always been confident, certain, decisive. Admitting failure did not seem natural to him. Do you know what I discovered after you left? He asked. I shook my head gently. Nothing important actually collapsed overnight. It happened one thoughtful detail at a time. Birthdays forgotten, employees overlooked, clients who no longer felt remembered, meetings that lost their purpose because the human part quietly disappeared. I smiled faintly. Calendars are easy, caring is harder. Adrian nodded slowly. That is exactly what I finally understood. We continued walking beneath rows of maple trees, whose leaves drifted lazily onto the pathway around us. He never once asked me to return. That surprised me most of all. Instead, he asked something entirely different. Claire, outside that office. Were you happy? The question stopped me in my tracks. During 5 years of working together, nobody had ever asked it. I looked toward the fading sunset before answering honestly. Sometimes. But I forgot who I was becoming. Adrian lowered his eyes for a moment. And now, I thought about the library. My sister. Quiet mornings with coffee, books, sleep. Smiling without checking my phone every 5 minutes. Now I am remembering. Adrian accepted the answer without argument. They were only two simple words, yet I could see him recognizing something that every business success had failed to teach him. There are victories measured in numbers, and there are victories measured in peace. For the first time since we met, we were not standing on opposite sides of power. We were simply two ordinary people, sharing the truth beneath an autumn sky, and somehow that conversation carried more weight than every executive meeting we had ever attended together. We reached the edge of the conservatory garden, just as the last streaks of sunlight disappeared beyond the skyline, leaving Manhattan wrapped in the soft glow of evening lights. Neither of us seemed eager to end the conversation, yet neither of us tried to return to the familiar roles we had occupied for 5 long years. Adrian walked beside me at an unhurried pace, hands tucked inside his coat pockets, watching families gather for photographs beneath the changing leaves. "There is something else I need to tell you," he said quietly. I looked toward him without speaking. "After you left, I reviewed every major operational decision made during the restructuring." He paused before continuing. "Your position was eliminated because it appeared unnecessary on an organizational chart. I signed the approval because I believed efficiency could always replace experience." He gave a small, almost bitter smile. "It turns out, spreadsheets are remarkably poor at measuring wisdom." I could not help smiling at that. It was the first time I had ever heard Adrian describe business with even the slightest hint of humility. We stopped beside a quiet reflecting pool, where the city lights shimmered across the water. "Vanessa resigned yesterday," he said. That surprised me. "Why?" Adrian looked toward the water instead of at me. "The board lost confidence after several strategic failures. She believed every problem could be solved by reducing numbers. Unfortunately, she reduced the wrong ones." He never sounded angry, only disappointed. That difference mattered. A month earlier, I might have quietly celebrated hearing news like that. Instead, I simply nodded. I hope she finds something that suits her better. Adrian turned toward me, studying my expression with quiet curiosity. "You are not happy she failed?" I shook my head gently. "Someone else's mistake cannot become the foundation of my happiness." The words lingered between us. Adrian smiled faintly, almost to himself. That is exactly the answer I should have expected. We resumed walking through the peaceful paths lined with benches and lanterns. After several minutes, he spoke again. "The board wants me to rebuild the executive office." I waited patiently. "They also asked whether I intended to offer you your position back." There it was. The question I had quietly expected since his phone call. I stopped beneath an old maple tree, watching one crimson leaf drift slowly onto the path between us. "And?" I asked. Adrian surprised me again. "I told them I would not ask until I understood whether returning would actually be good for you." I looked at him carefully, searching for the ambitious executive who always expected immediate answers. Instead, I found someone who seemed willing to hear one he might not like. "Claire," he continued softly, "I do not want you back, simply because the company needs you. I already know it does. I want to know whether there is any version of that life which still belongs to you." My eyes wandered toward the skyline, rising beyond the trees. 5 years of memories passed through my mind. Early mornings, late nights, endless calendars, invisible responsibilities. Then came newer memories. Emma laughing over hot apple cider, students smiling inside the library, peaceful mornings with coffee by my apartment window. For the first time in years, both futures stood clearly before me. I took a slow breath before answering. "I cannot return to the person I used to be." Adrian nodded immediately. "I would not ask you to." His answer came without hesitation, and somehow that honesty made the decision even harder. "The woman who left your office believed her value came from making everyone else's life easier," I said quietly. "The woman standing here has finally learned that her own life deserves that same care." Adrian lowered his head for a brief moment before looking back at me with calm acceptance. "Then perhaps this conversation was never about bringing you back." His voice carried no disappointment, only understanding. "Perhaps it was about making sure you knew that someone finally recognized what you gave before it became too late to say thank you." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The city continued breathing around us, steady and alive, while somewhere deep inside I realized that genuine appreciation, when finally spoken with sincerity, can heal wounds that money, titles, and power never even notice.